Hello, folks. I have with me a man that needs no introduction. I think that everybody's probably familiar with your work. This is Jared Taylor. But if you wanted to give my audience that perhaps aren't familiar with you a little bit of a rundown on who you are, what you do, what you're most famous for, what you're most controversial for.
Gosh. Well, I have been running American Renaissance for more than 30 years now.
Wow, really?
And yes, it's been more than 30 years. I started it in 1990, for heaven's sake. Yes. And it was a print publication, a monthly print publication until 2012. And then we finally went 21st century and moved entirely to the internet. But we have videos and podcasts, and we've had a very active website all that time. And we are basically a race realist white advocacy organization. And race realism, of course, being the recognition that race is a genuine biological phenomenon, and it's not some sort of leftist optical illusion, which is what we're taught to believe these days. And also, white advocacy has to do with the recognition that we as whites have legitimate interests, just like any other group. And it would seem obvious if you think about it, but these two factors are recognizing race and that the races are not globally interchangeable, which is another one of the myths that we're supposed to have swallowed whole, and recognizing that we as whites have legitimate group interests of our own that we must defend. This, of course, makes you a pariah. So that's all that's required to be an international hate criminal. That's gotten me banned from at least 28 countries and kicked off of
Really?
so many. Oh yes, oh yes. Oh gosh, I may not look evil, but I am thoroughly evil to the tips of my toes.
Oh,
Mm.
good Lord. In terms of white advocacy, is one of the reasons I talked to Kevin McDonald about guilt in the Western psyche a few days ago, and he thinks that it's unique to white people. I was wondering if you agree that this is something that's unique to the Western psyche, and if that's one of the largest reasons that we've been able to be weakened and propagandized on such an incredible scale.
That is going to be the great mysterious question if we really are shoved aside and walk off the stage of history, and the authors of the great Chinese World Encyclopedia are going to scratch their heads and ask themselves, these white guys, they really had it going well for hundreds of years, and then poof, they were gone.
Yeah.
Why? Now, I don't think we'll be gone. I hope we will not be gone, and I'm doing my best to make sure that we do stick around and that we can resume some of our greatness. But the question is why? And it's certainly true, as Kevin McDonald says, that today, over the past maybe 60 to 70 years, we have shown a pathological kind of guilt and altruism, a kind of feeling that no other race displays. And it would be easy to say that this is really part of our cultural and even our biological heritage, except that maybe 100 years ago, we were not that way.
Mhm.
After all, let us not forget that the British and the French and the Spanish, they had huge overseas colonial empires. And they undertook colonialism because they thought that whites were frankly superior at organizing society. Not only were they going to cultivate these empires for their own benefit, and there's undoubtedly a portion of that, but at the same time, they were to uplift the natives. There was a white man's burden. The French referred to it as the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission of the French. The British had the same attitude. The Spanish, perhaps a little bit less so. They were probably more openly exploitative, but they too meant to Christianize and to educate the people that they colonized. So this is a relatively new phenomenon.
Mhm.
And so what has changed? I could go into a whole list of things that could have contributed to this real denaturing of whites. How is it that the white man lost his spine? There are many theories about this. I find none of them entirely satisfactory, even in one at a time or all in combination, because what we're doing is so wholly unnatural.
Mhm.
Never in the history of the world has a population that has had the capacity to repel replacement been willing to undergo replacement. And it's now practically a cliche to talk about the great replacement because, in fact, it's happening,
Mhm.
not only in the United States, But in practically every one of our traditional homelands, all of our white homelands, whites are diminishing in numbers, and it is considered virtuous to welcome this.
Mhm.
Why is this happening? Again, we could probably spend the next hour talking about the various reasons as to why. Again, I'm not satisfied with any of them, but this is a huge mystery, and I don't know really how to reverse this trend. And I'm not sure we really even have to understand the reasons for it in order to fight back against it. But it
Yeah.
is utterly unique.
I agree. I think that some of it, I know you just said that we could spend the next hour philosophizing about the reasons, but I think a lot of it is this internalize the self-loathing that people are expressing by not procreating, by their carbon footprint and all this stuff. They just hate themselves in that way. They just
And
refuse to propagate.
And yet, why us? Now,
Mm,
when it comes to refusing to propagate, the East Asians, some of the highest IQ people in the world, they too are not propagating.
mhm,
So there are different dynamics going on. They, on the other hand, are unwilling to be replaced physically. The Japanese, for example, their
mhm,
population is declining by hundreds of thousands every year because deaths exceed births.
mhm,
And occasionally you'll have some Japanese futurist who calculates that, well, by the year 2000, who knows, 300, there'll be no more Japanese. They'll all have
mhm.
died out. But
Right.
they are not about to open their borders and let in all the Pakistanis and the Indonesians who would love to come benefit from a society that the Pakistanis and the Indonesians were incapable of creating. They
Mhm.
have a healthy sense of preservation, at least at that level.
Yeah.
We whites are the only ones who not only refuse to have children, but we seem to be perfectly happy to adopt children of other races and to let people utterly unlike ourselves and who, in many cases, hate us come into our countries at such a rate that they will outnumber us. This is unique to white people.
I've heard you speak about, I think it was the Ivory Coast. Is that where you developed some of these race realist theories?
Well, that was just one of the most remarkable of the channel markers on my voyage, so to speak, to enlightenment. I was an utterly conventional liberal on race until I was in my early to late 30s. And I was in my late teens, actually, when I was vagabonding around West Africa.
Oh,
And I had,
Lord.
yes, oh, I had a great time. I was really quite the wild man in my youth. Uh, uh, oh, I wanted to go everywhere and do everything and see everything, but own nothing. And I did it on practically no money at all. It, in any case, I had been in Ivory Coast. And Ivory Coast at that time, this was in about 1970. It's a long time ago. In 1970, the Ivory Coast is doing so well that they referred to it as the Japan of West Africa. And one of the reasons it was doing very well is that there was a very heavy French involvement. The French had been the initial colonizers of the Ivory Coast. And after decolonization, which took place, I believe, in 1960, the French had maintained a kind of advisory presence. And so that every high government minister or even a sub-minister had a Frenchman working with him. He was called
Right.
the French homologue. And this guy would give the Ivorian advice, and sometimes they had sense enough to take it. In any case, Ivory Coast is doing very well. And I had been in Ivory Coast for, 3 or 4 weeks, and I traveled overland to Liberia. Now, as soon as you cross the border, it looked as though this place was still stuck in, I don't know, the 19th century. There were roads, but they were full of potholes that could swallow a car.
Mm.
Everybody was dressed in rags. And I went to Monrovia, which was the capital. And at that time, I was 19 years old, and I always made a point of going to the major university because I would meet people my age, people who had some knowledge and some interest in world affairs and the history of their own country. And I remember asking a young Liberian man, I hate to be rude, but why is it that your country is just such a horrible mess compared to Ivory Coast, which is just next door?
Mhm.
I mean, that was the sort of thing I would ask people back when I was brash and young. And he says, oh, that's not a hard question to answer at all. We did not have the benefit of being colonized by whites.
Mhm.
He took it for granted. in his view, it was obvious that Liberia was a mess because it had always been run by blacks. And that's the long and the short of it. He made no apologies for it. It's as if he was saying, well, the sky's blue. What do you expect?
Right.
Now, that was not enough to jog me out of all of my illusions, but it really did stagger me because at the time I had swallowed the usual nonsense about colonization being this horrible blood-sucking enterprise whereby whites had come along, and who knows, maybe the Africans would have invented nuclear fission and jet aircraft if we hadn't come by and stymied them.
Right.
The point
It'd be
is,
a regular Wakanda, right?
that's right. That's right. We had nipped Wakanda in the bud, and the poor Africans were terribly exploited by us. So this was staggering to me. But it took me, I'd say another 10 years at least, before I finally accepted the reality of race and the terrible crisis that white people face. But it
planted the seed, and that's an important experience.
Yes, it was an important experience. You know, there was something else that happened even earlier. And that was a heavyweight championship fight. And I believe it was in, would it have been about 1960? And Ingemar Johansson was a Swede, and Floyd Patterson was a black heavyweight boxer. And I was living in Japan. I had never met a black person in my life. I grew up in Japan. And I remember seeing a photograph on the newspaper in the sports section, this is in Japan, of Floyd Patterson, the black man, standing over Ingemar Johansson, flat on the canvas, knocked out, and thinking, well, wait a minute. Don't we have one of our guys who can beat this fella? Despite the fact that I was an American, Floyd Patterson was American, Ingemar Johansson was Swede. And I remember asking my father, what's going on here? Can this guy really beat everybody in the world? He said, yeah, he's a champion of the world. But now this is an interesting thing. I did not recall having had that thought until I arrived at a pretty well-developed racial consciousness. That was something that came back to me many years later.
Yep.
I remember thinking, for heaven's sake, even as a 9-year-old, I had an incipient understanding or consciousness of a loyalty to race. But all of growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s, it had all been suppressed. So I think that is the natural state of all people. But now, as you know, of course, white people in particular are subjected to this constant barrage in this massively successful, alas, attempt to snuff out any consciousness of race among whites.
That's definitely true. I have a similar experience growing up. I was
Have you?
8 or 9, and I lived in a very wealthy part of St. Louis, like a rich county that was predominantly white. And then they did inner city busing from East St. Louis into this.
My.
And so I remember being like in elementary school and asking my mom, like, I know that we're supposed to believe that people with different skin colors are the same, but like these people are clearly not the same as us. And my mom was like, do not let anybody hear you say that.
Wow.
And it didn't occur to me until years later that I was kind of on it when I was 8 or 9, you know?
Isn't that interesting? But she did not say to you, no, of course they're exactly like us. She said,
don't let anybody hear you say that, which I think was probably a perfect response.
Yes, it was.
Because she didn't want me to stifle my my ability to recognize the world around me, but she wanted me to appreciate social cues so that I wasn't a pariah.
But you see, that is the problem with white people. White people, like your mother, I'm sure she is a sainted and blessed person, but she understood something important, but she didn't want you talking about it, and I'm sure she never talked about it. And that's the way even Southerners have traditionally been. It was beneath one's dignity to speak insultingly of Black people. My parents were all Southerners. I remember my grandparents' generation. They took it for granted. Races were different, and Blacks would never be like whites. But you didn't talk about it. This is something that was understood. It was rude to talk about it. And it is this sense of decorum and this wish not to offend that has led us into this terrible dilemma.
That's true.
Now, what your experience with this busing program reminds me of something that Robert Patterson once said. He was the founder of the White Citizens Councils in the 1960s. It was set up to fight school integration and residential integration. And he said, the sure cure for integration fever is a stiff dose of Negroes, except he didn't use the word Negro.
Oh, Lord.
In any case, yes, it should be. You see, that's the thing. A stiff dose of blacks really should cure anyone of his illusions about them. And yet, like you, like so many people, when you ask folks, even who are liberal, real concrete details about their experience with non-whites, in particular blacks, they will tell stories that are very similar to yours. And yet they insist that these were unique experiences, they cannot be generalized from. And if we just do the right thing, if white people clear their personalities and their souls and their hearts of racism, black people will be just like us, maybe better.
Right. And I think that I didn't grow up with this real understanding about my race or other people's races. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s where I was constantly being told that I was bad, that I was responsible for all of the world's ills, that it really began to matter to me, because it put me in this position of defensiveness. I never would even be talking about these things on the internet if I didn't feel personally attacked for things like slavery and for all of these things. We're the only people that went across the entire world trying to end slavery, and I
Yeah.
still am personally responsible for this.
That's right. That's right. And we will be forever.
Mhm.
I had no particular desire to be an activist until I was in my 30s and started doing this. I had no particular ambitions of any kind outside of the ordinary. And I felt as though I was driven to this.
Mhm.
And sometimes I try to imagine what my life would have been like had I lived under a regime that I could respect. Imagine living in a country in which you have confidence in your government. Yes, yes. I mean, you laugh at the very idea. But in the 1950s, about 80 to 85% of Americans would tell a pollster they trusted the federal government to do the right thing all the time or almost all the time. Can you imagine that?
Oh my
Can you
gosh, no.
imagine living in a country like that? And if I had not felt compelled to stand up for my people, it's impossible to know what sort of life I would have led.
Mhm.
But imagine how much happier we would be if we were to live in a society in which we were recognized and we had faith in the people who are making all these decisions.
Mhm.
It's really, and that is, to me, I believe, one of the great psychological obstacles of bringing people around to our way of looking at things, because they have to realize, my gosh, for the last 70, 80 years, our country has been on the road to nowhere, on the road to perdition. And the people who are making all of these important decisions for us and for our children, for our grandchildren, have got it wrong. That's a terrible feeling.
Right.
And sometimes when people will say to me, you really opened my eyes to what's going on. And I'll say, I feel so sorry for you. You'll
Mhm.
never be happy again.
I know. Go back to those blue pill days. But I think part of the problem with the
Mm,
American culture in particular is that we don't have any comparison. I'm sure growing up in Japan and the stories I've heard from people that have lived in Japan, it's such a high trust society.
yes.
I know people sleep in bars and things like that. People never get robbed. My friends that lived there, they would leave their door unlocked all the time, and their neighbors would just come in and bring them food, and they never worried about it. And they truly have this racial and ethnic allegiance. My brother's Japanese friend left all of his expensive camera equipment at a bar when he got drunk. And he went back the next day to get it. He just knew it was going to be there. And the bartender had put it behind the bar because he said that he saw some shifty Chinese men at that bar. And so he knew that he had to protect
Mm,
the camera equipment. And he just went there like knowing it was safe and that somebody had taken care of it. And I just cannot imagine living in a society like that. We live in such a low trust society. When I lived in
yes.
Seattle, I didn't know my neighbors. Places I had lived for years and years, never met my next door neighbor. I'd go everywhere with my headphones in. No, I wouldn't talk to anybody, no interaction with people. And Americans just don't realize, because it's been such a slow burn, this is not the way that communities are built, that they're meant to be, that we're meant to live. And if they had any point of comparison, I'm sure your experience in Japan growing up really set the stage for your views on race realism. I think that they may too be susceptible to some kind of anti-propaganda.
The fact is, no one ever believes me when I say this, but growing up in Japan probably had no effect on my views on race.
Really?
You would expect it to have.
Mm.
And it's certainly true. I grew up in a very high trust society in which no one was ever afraid of being robbed or having his house burgled. I mean, these sort of things happened very, very rarely and occasionally.
Right.
But to the extent that I thought about how the United States and Japan differed, I would have thought of it in some sort of cultural terms. I would never have thought of it in terms of diversity or racial differences, none of those things at all. And so it was only in retrospect that, having come to a greater understanding of racial differences, that I looked back on Japan and recognized what a tremendous advantage the Japanese have for being homogeneous. On the other hand, homogeneity alone isn't what matters. I mean, it's a good thing, but the Haitians are pretty homogeneous, but they
Right.
live in a very low trust society. So the basis is what race are the people you're dealing with? And then the other question is homogeneity. Of course, given a choice, is always better than heterogeneity, because people trust people who are like themselves. I don't know if you recall Robert Putnam. He was a famous
The
professor.
famous study of
Yes,
high
yes.
trust societies. Yes.
That's right. And this guy had looked into all of these different communities all around the country, and he tested them for this and that, poverty and commuting distances and age ratios, to try to figure out what made some communities higher trust and lower trust. And he found it's homogeneity that leads to high trust. And he
Yes,
was
and
so
then he sat on
appalled.
those findings for, I think, 2
Exactly.
years.
That's right. He
And
was
then they
so
ruined
appalled.
him anyway, right? Oh,
That's
poor
right.
guy. I'm sure I can imagine him just reading that data and being like, "No. Oh, no. What am I gonna do now?"
And that just goes to show you, think of all the wonderful studies that could have been done, or perhaps might even have been done, and we don't know the results.
Yes,
Because
definitely.
results would be so shocking to the people who run the country
Mhm.
and to the people who, even the scientists, have to brown nose in order to get their grant money.
So because, you see this as a racial issue, not necessarily a trust issue in society, do you think that American or Western paternalism in any third world nation is inherently futile?
No. In fact, I understand that in Jamaica and even in South Africa, there is a fairly strong recognition in certain quarters that those countries were better run by white people. There is a kind of schizophrenia, apparently. I have friends in South Africa, some who are South African, and a good friend who is American, who's lived in South Africa. On the one hand, South Africans will tell you, well, yes, uh, if you want to get a job, you're much better off working for a white man. A white man will treat you fairly. A white man will not try to cheat you out of your wages. You can talk and negotiate with a white man. Also, that white people are clever about running a country. On the other hand, we hated apartheid,
Mhm.
and we want to run our own country, a kind
Right.
of a schizophrenia, a
Mhm.
desire to be in charge, despite the recognition that when whites are in charge, things are so much better. Now, one of the problems is the people who are in charge, they are getting enormously fat and rich on a country that for everyone else is going to hell. So
Mhm.
they're the people who would have to change, and they're the least likely to change because they're benefiting from this terrible situation
Right.
from which everyone else suffers. But no, I understand, and certainly I've not done any investigation of this myself, and certainly the Congressional Research Service isn't going to look into the extent to which a pre-colonial desire exists among formerly colonized people. But
Mhm.
my understanding is that that desire is by no means absent.
That's true. There's that famous documentary, or it's infamous amongst people on the dissident right. Its name escapes me, but there's that Chinese fellow who's developing all this African land, and he's telling this African guy, like, "Look, you don't know how good you had it, and then you destroyed everything with your government corruption, and now the Chinese have come in, and we're not as friendly as Europeans." And so I always think about that, and I'm like, wow, perhaps they were in better situations. And Western imperialists, they really did want to bring their way of life, and they brought a lot of kindness to these places. And I
Yes,
hate that people view this historically as us just doing terrible things. I mean, we weren't
exactly.
raping and pillaging people. We were building
No.
schools and improving water supplies and things like that, building churches.
That's exactly right. And just a few days ago, I saw a YouGov poll in which Americans of various races were asked whether it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing when whites become a minority in the year 2045, 2050, whenever it is. And I was disappointed by the number of whites who think it's just going to be wonderful and crackerjack and it's all going to be fine and dandy. There is a slight majority of whites who say it won't be a good thing over those who say that it will be a good thing. But the vast number say, it's not going to make a difference, or they don't have an opinion. They've been taught not to have an opinion on this. The surprise to me was that the group who was most convinced that it's just going to be heaven on earth when whitey is a minority were
White people?
blacks. Or
Oh,
blacks.
oh,
No.
okay.
For whites, the number who think it's going to be great, it's as I recall, it was about 25%. The number who think it's not going to be so great is maybe 30%, and then everybody in between says, it's not going to make a difference. But it was the blacks who say, oh boy, it's going to be great when whitey is a minority. And I'm thinking to myself, these people are fools. Are Mexicans or people from China or these dot Indians who come and tell us how to run the country, are they going to be nice to them the way we have been? I mean, every other third world group has got its own set of sob stories.
Mhm.
Are they going to listen to blacks who want their hand out for reparations for slavery that these other folks had absolutely nothing to do
Nothing
with?
to do with, right?
Nothing to do with. But the idea that blacks think it's just going to be great when whites are a minority, it's yet another example of the incredibly foolish ideas that are so constantly propagated. And it is also an example of perhaps the foolishness of adults and the wisdom of children. We published in American Renaissance one of the most popular articles. It was about teaching in an all-black school. It was written by a white guy. And he describes, it was an elementary school or maybe a junior high school. In any case, the children were pretty young. He describes just how irresponsible they are and how they don't want to do any work and how everything is racist and it's the white man's fault. But once, I thought this was one of the most memorable lines in the entire article. They were talking about welfare and how you can get money for just staying at home. And he asked his class, what would it be like? What would it be like for you all if there were no white people? And apparently, the unanimous response was, we be screwed.
Really?
Yes, yes. These children knew at some level that they depended on white people to keep the society going, to keep the welfare checks coming in. I thought that was quite remarkable.
That
Now,
is remarkable.
this article was written maybe 20 years ago, so I don't know to what extent that kind of wisdom has trickled down to elementary school students.
Mm.
But that was very, very interesting. And it's certainly a contrast to these adults who are polled who think it's going to be just heaven on earth when the bottom rail is on top, as they used
Mm.
to say after the Civil War.
Do you think that part of this is a biological and evolutionary response to being not having to plan for the future? Like in European societies, if you didn't plan for the next season or for the winter, you and your entire family would die. But I think there's kind of this wealth and abundance and resources in African nations and things like that, that perhaps they didn't they didn't evolve in the same way where they had to do long-term planning. I watched the show. This is so ridiculous. I watched the show Deadliest Roads, and I watched one in Haiti,
Mm,
and they were traveling from one part of the country to another, and every trip was this arduous near-death experience.
yes.
But they never managed to like fill the potholes or do work on the buses. They would just take it one trip at a time. There was just essentially no long-term planning for anybody. And I was just watching it. I was like, why wouldn't you just fix the road so that the subsequent trip is not as terrible, so that people don't die, so that you don't have people like on top of the bus falling off and falling underneath the wheel wells and breakdowns and all this. And I was just wondering, do you think that this is an evolutionary thing?
Yes, I think the evidence for this is overwhelming. Clearly, we can only speculate, but blacks evolved in an environment that was much less demanding. When it's warm all year round, there is food on the trees and on the bushes all year round. You don't have to plan. You don't have to think the future in the way you have to in a very demanding cold climate. And that's why East Asians, who evolved in an equally cold climate, are on average more intelligent and more
Mhm.
forward-looking than white people are. I think the evidence for that's likewise overwhelming. The differences are not all that great, but I think we have to recognize those differences when we see them. So yes, blacks certainly do not think ahead in the same way that whites do on average. And that reminds me, this American friend who I told you lives in South Africa and lived in South Africa many years, he got into some kind of argument about medical insurance. And blacks just could not grasp the idea of medical insurance. Uh, and my friend would say, well, look, if you get sick, you're going to have to pay the doctor. And the boy said, well, boss, I'm not sick now. I'm not
Yeah.
sick now. Why I worry? Yes, the idea, okay, maybe I'll get sick, but I'm not sick now, so I'm not going to pay now.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thinking. You live in the moment because you're just not tuned in the same way. One of the classic tests of the ability to defer gratification, as it's called. That's an aspect of thinking ahead, is realizing that, it's important for me to get a good grade on this exam so that I can get into good school and get a good job and make a living and attract a good woman, have a family, all of these things. So you don't go partying the night before the big bio exam. That is deferring gratification. You have goals. Well, the test for this in young children is to give them a marshmallow and tell them, if I leave you alone in a room all by yourself for 10 minutes with this one marshmallow
I'll give you
and you
two.
haven't eaten it, yes, I'll give you two. Yes, you know this story. And Asians are better able to not eat the marshmallow in the hope of getting two than whites, and
Mhm.
whites are considerably better than blacks.
Mhm.
There's this pattern that goes Asians at one end and blacks at the other end, and whites more or less in between. That is very, very, very consistent across so many different parameters. Now, this is not to say that we should be replaced by Asians or that I want to be Asian or no, I believe in diversity. I think Asians have built wonderful societies. God bless them. I hope the Japanese are not replaced by anything but Japanese, that it continues to be Japanese and the Chinese, the Indians, and everybody. But we have to recognize that groups are not interchangeable. And that is the great, 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 terrible taboo in this country. And I would say, I think that, we look back on history and we see intellectual failures. For example, the assumption that the earth is the center of the universe. There were people who had figured out that, well, no, the earth revolves around the sun.
And we
But it was,
killed them.
we killed them. We killed some of
Right.
them. That's right. Now, you can say, well, gosh, that was just terrible. But in real life, what difference did it make? Ordinary people did not change the way they lived. Their morals and their value system did not change when we figured out that, well, no, the earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around. To me, a vastly more significant intellectual failing is the unwillingness to recognize the overwhelming evidence of racial differences in temperament and ability. This changes everything we do because, as you know, in the United States today, every inability of blacks and to some extent Hispanics to live up to the white level is our fault. And so, despite the fact that there are obvious differences, genetic differences, temperamental differences, biological differences, we have turned our society inside out, upside down, trying to build a society that accounts for all of this horrible, horrible white racism, which is the only permissible explanation for Black failure.
And
This
wouldn't it
is,
be easier if we just recognized the reality of the situation?
yeah, well, it would be easier, and I think that it would be much better for Blacks too, because
I agree. Yeah.
yes, when we constantly tell them it's not your fault, not your fault, put your feet up. It's the honky's fault. What are we telling them? We're telling them that nothing they can do to get ahead is going to work. Of course, ultimately, I think the only possible real solution is separation. They have to be in charge of their destiny, and we have to be let alone so that we can hold our destiny in our own hands too. But again, this inability to accept a basic truth about human nature and biology and racial differences, this has turned our country into such a hall of mirrors, such an Alice in Wonderland of crazy things, from the idea that math is racist, for heaven's sake, or that bird watching is racist because not enough Black people want to watch birds, or that the fact that there are more Blacks in jail or on welfare than whites, this is your fault personally. You personally responsible for this. And I am too. This is just nuttiness, a kind of a mass insanity that's taken over the entire country for lack of an ability to see something that's obvious. This too, I think, is really unprecedented in human history.
I think so as well. And the expectations that we had for Black people in the 40s, that they live their own lives and accept responsibilities for their own behaviors and for their own jobs. They had such a better quality of life. The divorce rate was lower in the 1940s for Black communities than white communities, which is just shocking now. And so we have to think about how we're incentivizing their communities to be worse. And this cannot be what Black people actually want. And I think the grand irony of all of this is that people like us, we actually do want to preserve diversity. Isn't that hilarious? If I go to India, I would like to see Indian people. If I go to China, I want to see Chinese people. And people should appreciate their racial heritage, and they should have reverence for their ancestors. And the fact that that is being lost is actually deeply sad to me. So it's so preposterous. But I did have kind of an esoteric question for you. I think that this rise in Black on Asian hate crimes in the United States is perhaps emblematic of a larger societal issue. And I was wondering if you had any opinions on this. Are we going to have to ally with Asians?
To some extent, we already have. As you know, Chesa Boudin, the crazy district attorney in San Francisco who never met a criminal he didn't love, he's been voted out of office. And this is a consequence of the terrible state that San Francisco finds itself in. This movement to kick him out was largely led, as far as I can tell, by Asians. Asians have got no time for this stuff. Likewise, here where I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, there's a very, very selective high school. And of course, Blacks can't get into it because it's so selective. And so there was this big movement on to change the selection process, make it to some degree a lottery so we get more diversity. And it was the Asians who marched right up and said, like hell, you're going to do this. No. Of course, they were the ones who were passing the test far at greater rates than whites. But they're the ones who are saying, no, none of this, none of these handouts for Blacks. It's got to be strictly merit. Now, they benefit from merit, and at the same time, because they are not intimidated and browbeaten to the extent whites are, they are prepared to say, hey, that's wrong, and that is hurting us. And so, yes, we are already objective allies in that respect. At the same time, I have been surprised by the number of young Asians. They've spent too much time in universities. And they will say, okay, yeah, it does look like these anti-Asian hate crimes are not MAGA-wearing white people who have been inspired by the fact that Donald Trump talked about the Chinese virus. No, these are Black people. But let us not forget that if Black people are attacking Asians, it's because they are agents of white supremacy. These poor Black people have been manipulated by a society run by whites for the benefits of whites, and that's what explains these attacks. What an utterly preposterous cuckoo thing to say.
Right.
But there are these academic type Asians who will actually say things like this. I think
Mhm.
they're a minority, but they're the ones who get all the press, of course, because the people who publish the New York Times, the Washington Post, and run CBS, they love to hear from people like that.
And that's a
So,
testimony to the permeability of our culture specifically, because this would never happen in China. That propaganda would never get through. And even in Japan, their government's more permissive, their media is more permissive to allow things in, but they're not being propagandized on this level either.
no. And this, all of this craziness and the extent to which white people have been made to feel, and in some cases, I think genuinely may feel, that they are personally responsible for the failures of blacks. No matter what they think, no matter what they do, no matter how good their intentions, they are personally responsible. White silence is violence. What an insane slogan. I think there are people who believe that. But this is a testimony to the extraordinary power of media and propaganda. And this is not even something that a tyrannical government has imposed by commissars wearing hats with little red stars on them. No, these are private companies that are ostensibly independent. And I don't believe they necessarily get around the table and say, okay, today we're going to hit Whitey this way. They just all think the same thing because they went to all the same schools. It's not a conspiracy. This is just the way they think, and they're in positions of power. But for this kind of utter lunacy to have been propagated so insistently and so successfully, yet again, this is an astonishing thing. And the authors of that great Chinese encyclopedia are again going to scratch their heads.
I think so as well. So within the dissident right, especially race realism, it's no longer a controversial or disputed subject. Do you think there's still, although you spent your life doing this, so I wonder if this is a ridiculous question, but do you think that there is still utility in the conversation in terms of converting normies, or have we
Oh,
just begun to talk to each other about this?
no. I think there is a tremendous utility in this. And I think the reason why I have been so sedulously banned is a recognition by people who are running the media and running the country that we are persuasive. And you have to ban us. Otherwise, we are going to be extremely successful. And despite the terrible bans that American Renaissance has faced, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all gone. And I can't tell you how many email blasters have gotten rid of us. We can't process credit cards. Nevertheless, people find us. They find us largely because the other side is just pushing them into our arms. When you tell white people that they're racist, whether they're trying or not, that they enjoy white privilege, even if they don't realize it, that they're born racist, basically, that they're inherent oppressors, they're like, what the heck is this? And so even though Google buries our responses way down at the bottom of page 10, they're finding us. They're finding us more and more. And they're finding your channel, for heaven's sake. I don't know to what extent you get shuffled to the bottom of the deck in the YouTube search algorithms.
Mm.
I remember when we still had a channel, you could see the number of subscribers just going up. And then all of a sudden, it just leveled off.
Yeah.
Why was that? Well,
Yeah.
clearly they changed the algorithms.
Mhm.
But no, many people are finding us, and they're finding us, excuse me. And let us not overlook the fact that if our society is to change in any way, more people have to agree with us.
Mhm.
That really should be our objective. When I run a website like American Renaissance, it's very easy to fall into a kind of mindset in which we want to rally the comrades or we want to wow the comrades. Well, there is a certain satisfaction in being respected by fellow white advocates. But my number one goal, and I try to keep this in mind all the time, is to persuade people who don't yet agree with us. And I think that we can have a website that is also useful for the comrades, including information they may be unaware of, making arguments that they may not have heard, but at least for the outward-looking aspect of the work we do, we must always think in terms of intelligent, thoughtful white people, or even just thoughtful white people, or just even white people who are open to a different point of view. And as I said, people who certainly people my age who were reared on the idea of the civil rights movement, in which, okay, we're going to just start treating people equally and everything will be fine. And then they get turned around. They turn around. Somebody says, no, 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 no. You can't treat people equally. That's colorblind racism. What? What? Being on time is racist. What?
Mm.
What? A music theory is racist. They are, at the very least, confused and in some cases, hopping mad. And they will find us. And
Yep.
once they realize that there is a coherent view of the world into which their newly arriving consciousnesses can fit, I think it's tremendously important. To me, really the next level is community building. And there are a few places in the country where people have started in a quiet way. And I think this is really sort of the next frontier in developing racial consciousness and also developing communities in which we can rear healthy white children.
That was actually my next question. How
Mhm.
important is community building? I live in North Idaho, and we've kind of begun that here.
Yes.
Do you think that the government will have a more focused target? Should that be a deterrent to having large right-wing communities?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Many people fear this, but I have never really seen the government take any action against a community of that kind unless it was sort of an armed compound. If you don't do crazy things, if you don't stockpile weapons and you don't all live together and have some weird guru that you're
Right,
floating around,
right.
if you are healthy, normal white people, trying to be healthy, normal white people, there's frankly nothing they can do. If you meet and you establish communities where you celebrate each other's birthdays, you get together and have parties, you help each other on projects, you invite speakers in, you have meetings, all of this, and most important, if you can share the homeschooling duties, that kind of thing, in which children can grow up in an environment in which they're going to go into somebody's house. And in that house, they're not going to be fed Heather Has Two Mommies or The Life of Martin Luther King. They're not going to get that. They're not going to get that.
Mhm.
This is a very important, that's the next stage. People who are adults, they can live more or less isolated way. They might feel lonely, but they know they're not alone. They know there are people who agree with them. Children are different. Children
Mhm.
are very, very conformist. And you send them to the public school, they can believe their teachers. They're not going to believe their parents
Right.
unless the parents are remarkable parents.
Mhm.
So yes, community. Now, I've been talking about this for years. What have I done about it? Not much. But to the extent that you in Northern Idaho are doing this, and I've heard about this, I think that is a wonderful, laudable thing. The real problem, it seems to me, is not building the communities per se. It is attracting people who are new. Now, I can't tell you how many people read American Renaissance and they are perishing for community. And they say, look, just put up a bulletin board so that I can say, look, I live in the greater Albuquerque area. Contact me and let's get together. And I am tempted to do this. But my staff, who are perhaps younger and wiser than I,
They're worried
they,
about the feds?
they're not the feds, really not they're more worried about Antifa, not the feds. The feds really can't do anything about it. They are worried about some nasty white guy who's going to pretend to be racially aware and then is going to dox some poor guy who will lose his job, or they will bring sledgehammers to a meeting and break it up. That's what they're concerned about. And perhaps that's a realistic concern. I can see a lot of people my age who are not particularly savvy about internet security, trying to have some sort of community. It gets infiltrated, they get doxxed, and they get in trouble, and their wife leaves them, or whatever it is. That is what they're afraid of. My tendency is to plaster a bulletin board of this kind with warnings all over it, but then say, well, look, you're free, white, and 21. If you want to try this, give it a try. Because I can't tell you how many people are hungry for community. And to just give you a slightly different story, believe it or not, in the 1990s, before the Iron Curtain came down in such an impermeable way on dissident thought, C-SPAN used to cover the conferences that we put on. And on the podium, we would always put on the telephone number of the office. And for days after the C-SPAN broadcasts, we would get phone call after phone call after phone call. And for many of them, the message was, thank God, now I know I'm not insane. Because in those days, if you understood race in a realistic way, there was no internet.
Mhm.
You had no idea that there were other people out there who saw things the way you did. Now,
That's true.
so seeing things one way is great, but then doing things that very way, especially for children, especially for building healthy child rearing communities, that to me is the next stage.
I agree with you entirely. And I think that we have to assume some level of risk with community building, and that
Yes,
shouldn't
we
be a
do.
hindrance to us. Like, I know that a lot of people in North Idaho, they're so worried about Fed infiltration. We have these parties, and what if there was a Fed there? I'm like, if there's a Fed there, they're going to hear me saying exactly what I say in my
That,
personal conversations that I
that's
say on the
right.
internet.
That's
Uh,
right.
and
And no, you're absolutely right. I have one of those. I guess it's put out by. You say, "Hey Alexa," the smart speaker or something. You know what I'm talking about.
yep.
You wake it up and you can tell it to play Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony.
right.
And I know people who say, they're listening all the time. I said,
So
well,
what?
great, maybe they'll learn something.
Yeah,
Yeah. No,
exactly. I'm not doing any of this stuff. I'm not censoring myself in my house. I'm not avoiding
that's right.
certain computer things because I'm worried that they're tapping. I'm not doing any of this. If they want to hear what I'm saying in my private conversations,
Yes.
perhaps you're like you said, they'll learn something.
That's right. Well, good for you. I applaud you. I think there are too many people. I mean, it is true. The other side doesn't like us. The other side has a great deal of power. But what are the feds going to do? If the
Mhm.
Fed, if some FBI guy sat in my house 24 hours a day, what's he going to hear that I haven't already told you? He's going to hear that my lawn is not doing very well. That's not going to do him a
Neither's
bit of
mine, right?
good. Yeah.
And I think the key
So,
is to be
mm,
consistent across
yes,
the board and to be honest
exactly.
in your
That's
public
right.
life and in your private life. And I understand that I have
Yes.
a luxury that most people do not have. I have a job where I can say what I want, but I used to work in finance and I built this life so that I was impervious to people on the left canceling me. And I geared
Yes.
my life towards this. And I had a lot of benefits that other people don't have. But we do need to make ourselves hardier in that way. If you have a
Yes.
job where somebody could see a tweet that you wrote 10 years ago and totally destroy you, maybe you have the wrong job. Maybe it's time for you to think about other ways that you could benefit financially. And when these communities get large enough, especially in North Idaho, you have a ready-made network where people can hire you, where they can help you find a job, where it
Yes.
won't really matter that you said
That's
something
right.
race realist 15 years ago in the privacy of your own home or whatever. And that's really what we need to do. We're
Yes.
not assuming that great of a risk. Nobody's getting shot and killed
No, no,
arbitrarily. Like we've got this Antifa threat, but it's kind of whatever. Um, I,
that's
I
right.
think that we need to assume more risk and not be so afraid of the consequences.
Good for you. I am delighted to hear you saying these things. Whenever I say things like that, people say, well, okay, you've been out of class for 30 years. You're sort of bulletproof. You've got your own organization. Look, it's not some sort of magical thinking.
Right.
People can do it. People can
Yep.
do it. And compared to the people who've changed societies
Oh,
in the
yes. Yeah.
past, look at the Russian revolutionaries, for heaven's sake. They could get arrested and sent to Siberia.
Mhm.
They could get arrested and get a bullet in the back of the head.
Mhm.
We risk none of that. We
Right.
still do have the First Amendment, and I think it's going to be around for a little while longer. It's still perfectly legal to say the things we say. We're not going to go to jail for this.
Mhm.
More people have to be a little bit braver. Now,
Mhm.
if you really are in a high profile job and you're making a whole lot of money and you're giving a lot of it to white advocacy organizations, then that's fine too. Not everybody has to be out in the open. Not every has to be. And in a way, I am more worried about the guys who, I'm the great white warrior. No. Those guys are going to get us all in trouble. So there are many ways to help our people and to be a stand-up white man or a stand-up white woman. We
Mhm.
just have to think about it and help each other.
I totally agree, and I'm glad you're saying that because the thoughts that I'm hearing from the dissident right, I do it myself too. I'm engaged in a lot of despair peddling because I feel hopeless to some degree about the future of Western civilization. And then sometimes I'm community building and I feel like, well, the government could just come in here and wipe us all out in
But
one fell
no,
swoop.
but how could they do that? What could they do? I mean, they're not going to come in and shoot you. They're not going to come in and somehow kick you out of your houses. They're not going to somehow get you all fired from your jobs. There's really no, they don't really have purchase on you. Now, a lot of people think, okay, what are they going to do? Turn off the electricity to your houses? No, we really do have certain safeguards.
Mhm.
And there are many different communities that are built in the United States. Ours is the only one that has built-in headwinds that are so severe as these. But
Mhm.
the feds, what are they really going to do? I mean,
Mm.
realistically, are they going to sort of slap a white supremacist tax on your income? No,
Wouldn't
no.
that be something?
I mean, that day may come, but that's going to apply to all white people, not just us. So no, there's really not that much they can do. And the communities of which I'm aware, and some of the ones of which I'm aware, don't even like any kind of public mention of them.
Right.
And I understand that. They've been under the radar so far. There haven't been any negative press reviews about them, but they're building quietly and they're having a great time and they're rearing white children. I keep coming back to that phrase over and over again, white children, white children, white children. But uh, they're doing it. And I just don't think, even if the other side finds out, that there are really practical ways that they can get after us. The real problem would be, as I said, some hopped up Antifa type guy doing something violent or trying to dox people. That's
Oh
to
yeah, we
me
can
the
handle
real.
that too. I think that you're right that
Yes.
the social consequences are much more powerful
Yes.
in people's lives, and I encourage people to think about what getting canceled would be like. It's happened to me. It's happened to you. When I got doxxed, it was a horrible week. It was about 1 week, and then after that, I had this realization. Like I went on Facebook and I saw all these people that knew me my entire life just talking about how racist, racist. I'm like, you've known me my entire life, and you can't overcome something that you read about me in like Salon with 20 years of personal experience with me. And I realized now I can do and say whatever I want. I'm free.
Yes. And you find out who your real friends are. And
Yeah,
you
yeah.
probably made a whole lot of wonderful new friends.
I did. The network out here is just incredible. And
Yeah.
then you know what family's going to stand by you too.
That's right. That's
And you
right.
you get through it.
There's a liberation that
Mhm.
comes with it. Now, I find that the people, my childhood friends, most of them, they may disapprove or they may disagree, but they're still my friends. The
Mhm.
ones that I went to high school with. We're a very tight group. We went to this very small high school with a graduating class of 30, and we have reunions probably every 3 to 5 years. And uh, they will. They're a little askance at what I'm up to, but that does not affect the real affection and solidarity we feel as being part of this group. So it all depends. Well, and every case is different. Every case is different. Some people, their parents, for example, they will have a terrible experience with their parents. And then some people, they can be on politically opposite poles, but they still love each other absolutely in an unqualified way. That, to a large degree, is dependent on how individuals handle this particular problem and just the nature of the relationship you had to begin with.
Mhm.
But there is a risk. You're absolutely right. And I'm glad, though, that you're saying that we need to take more risks
Yep. Yep.
because that is the only way we can succeed. Fortune favors the brave. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Faint heart, ne'er won fair lady. I mean, there are many ways of saying the same thing.
I totally agree. And we're coming up on an hour, but I did have one last question that I've always wanted to ask you. Of all of the things that you've done in your life, what are you most proud of in your life's work?
Well, I'm proudest. I'm proudest of the fact that I have two wonderful children, and the greatest regret of my life is I didn't have five. Now, I really mean that sincerely. But the fact of having spent the last 30 years trying to stand up for my people, that really is something that gives me a real sense of having done my duty. And Robert E. Lee was not just being sentimental when he said duty is the beautifulest word in the English language. I think that's right. And when we can go to our graves, which we all do, if we can say to ourselves, yes, we did what we were put on earth to do, we did our duty, then I think we can all die happy.
Well, those are wonderful words to end on. And if I can appeal to my audience to do anything, it's to be brave and be bold and don't fear and Have
Do your
children.
and do your duty.
Yep,
That's
yep.
right.
Thank you so much. This is Jared Taylor of American Renaissance. What a lovely conversation. I hope that we can do it again soon.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting